Hello and welcome to another one of our beehiiv growth webinars. We're excited to have you with us today. I'm very pleased and privileged to be able to introduce our guest today, Francis Zierer. Many of you may know him as the editor extraordinaire of Creator Spotlight, one of the premier publications on everything going on in the creator economy, also host of one of the top podcasts on the creator landscape called Tasteland, comes out every week. I think I just gave the overview of your intro, Francis, but would you like to add any color there that I might have missed before we get started today?
No, I think the way I like to wrap up all those things I do, the newsletter, both the podcasts, is I study creators and the way they produce, distribute, monetize content, and I publish those studies, as it were, every week.
We'll love to hear that. We're super excited for the conversation that we're about to have. We had Francis on. How long ago was that? Was that back in October or so? September, October?
Yeah, I went on a couple. I think it was like September and October or September and November, as late as November, but it's been a while. It's been since last year.
It's been since last year, yeah. And we don't mean like the day before and after New Year. It actually has been since last year. We can jump in and get started with the agenda for today. So today's theme, topic, content that captivates, how you can streamline your writing process and unlock creativity for your newsletter. So today, what we're going to cover is understanding your audience, starting with the end in mind, developing a consistent voice and tone, mastering the art of hooks, structuring your content for readability, telling stories that engage your readers, and editing. At the end of that, we'll do a little Q&A with Francis. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, we ask that you drop them on our Q&A link. This helps keep the conversation focused, helps the conversation moving along so that we can really address all of the Q&A at the end. So with that, we got the agenda here. We're ready to jump in. So typically when we run these, we will start with a kind of laying the groundwork type slide where we talk about understanding your audience, finding your niche, writing consistently. But for this presentation specifically on writing and creating content that captivates people, we actually take a step back and really drill down on this idea of understanding your audience, because it's really, other than writing a newsletter or doing any kind of marketing where knowing your niche and knowing your audience is really important, when you're writing, understanding your audience is the first and last thing that is going to dictate your success. You need to know who it is that you're writing for and who it is that you are trying to reach with your content. And if you don't have that locked down tight, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand and basically reach that audience in an effective way. So one of the great approaches that we like to share here is, I don't know if it was created by them, it probably was just repeated by them, but Sean Puri and Sam Parr with the My First Million podcast have a great episode on writing and basically how to get into writing, how to build that habit. And one of the things that they recommend is using this audience of one approach. So when you are breaking down your audience, one, you got to know your niche and understand who that audience is. But as you start to drill down on who that audience is, really try to get very specific. Understand who, like the exact, have somebody, a person, like a real person, whether they're male, female, whatever, in mind that you can start building a persona around. If you're writing about a particular topic, what does their day look like? What sort of challenges do they face going through their day-to-day life? Now, you may feel like this isn't necessarily relevant to whatever you want to write about, but I assure you that it is. Understanding kind of the context in which how these people are going to move throughout their day is really valuable in understanding how you can best connect with folks. Francis, I know this whole slide is like music to your ears. Was curious that you provide a little bit of like insights there on how your process works when you're writing Creator Spotlight and beyond when you're doing writing.
No, I don't know. You always have to, I always try to assume that nobody wants to like read what I'm putting out or listen to what I'm putting out, right? You always have to assume that they are too busy doing other things. So for me, it's okay, who is that very specific person, and like, how can I actually earn their attention? I'll probably repeat this a few times over the course of the hour. Like, nobody owes you their attention, right? So it's, you have to figure out who this person is so you can really convince them to give you their attention by, I don't know, producing something of a high quality. But yeah, I interviewed a guy last year, Ryan Snedden, who talked about this really well, where he has a person with a very specific name and he knows the age. He's making a local newsletter, right, in Annapolis, Maryland. So he just gets as specific as possible. And I think you want to get as specific as possible, and you know that you're writing to other people too, and you can broaden it later on. But I think you always want to start from a very specific place. This is the person I'm trying to reach. This is what they would be looking for in a newsletter or whatever, YouTube, whatever it is, a product like this. So that's what I'm going to make. But you always start very specific.
Yeah, 100%. I think one of the things I want to double tap on is your comment around when you talk about what is competing for their time, what sorts of things are competing for their attention. I think that's really where this like very detailed audience of one persona building really shines, because it really should tell you and give you a roadmap for the things that are competing with their time. And that, at the end of the day, is one of the biggest indicators of whether you'll succeed or fail, is whether you can capture that attention and keep them coming back. For example, if you're trying to reach that suburban mom, stay-at-home mom who's got 2 kids and is rushing from dropping kids from school to coming back for chores to going to Pilates to doing whatever, picking the kids up from school, cooking dinner, etc. If that's your persona, if that's your audience of one, understanding that whatever your content is going to have to fit into that life, because your newsletter is not going to be more important than their children.
But it could be not be writing a long form newsletter in that case. It should be something that you read in like 3 to 5 minutes, because that's the amount of their time you're going to be able to earn.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see it as almost, that's obviously one approach, and maybe compounding that, layering on. It's if this can be a moment of escape, there are certain ways in which you can write to recognize that. So then that gets into the tone and the way that you position the writing and the way that you build that connection with the reader. And so in that way, getting as specific with that detailed persona as possible is really step one, and is really very valuable, because it will, I can't tell you, we're going to re-reference the slide again and again because it just keeps coming back. It's if you do that really holistic job of creating that persona at the beginning, it makes everything you're doing so much easier, from figuring out where to post on social, to what type of content to post, to which words to use, content length, aesthetic. All of these things become so much easier to nail down when you have that very clear idea of who it is that you're actually writing to. So that's the first thing, understand your audience. Second, we want to start with the end in mind. And so what we mean by this is there's this framework for writing. It's what do you want the reader, when they finish consuming the content, what do you want them to really, one, if they can remember one thing about the content, what is it that you want them to remember? 2, what do you want them to feel? And 3, what do you want them to do? So remember, feel, and do. These 3 kind of parts are 3 elements that drive action, that are going to drive recall and memory, and basically get people excited. And this again is from Sean and Sam. They talk about the beginning. What do you want them to take away? It really helps focus the rest of your writing. And sometimes you may not know that. So maybe you write the content, you come back and reevaluate through the lens of what you've written for the key takeaway. And other times you may have that key takeaway and then write something and then realize you've strayed, and then that may help you edit. It's not a strict system, but it is really helpful for understanding kind of the type of language, the type of emotion you're going to try to evoke. All depends on these 3 things. So target emotion, mad, sad, glad, and afraid, as my improv teachers would teach. So those are the main emotions. Do you want somebody to feel super happy and uplifted and maybe motivated out of a sense of happiness? Do you want them to feel some sort of like concern, where the emotion is something needs to change, or there's something wrong here? That's similar to like mad. These are all like the negative emotions. Sad, mad, and afraid are all like negative kind of fear-based ones, but they can be very effective. So I'm not going to say don't use them. It's just you have to recognize that when you go more negative or fear-based, you can go down a path that is very effective. But of course, we all have seen the impact of that very negative fear-based messaging across whether it's social media or the media at large. The reason why we see it everywhere is because it's very powerful. And so that kind of comes back to what is the feeling and who is your audience? What is your purpose? What are you trying to get them to do? And maybe in that case, go back to the suburban housewife. Maybe they're very politically active and there's already a lot of anxiety in the world. Maybe your approach is to bring a moment of levity and happiness, or something that's light and is going to, bring them back, because it's not playing on those kind of more negative emotions, but it's really making them feel positive. Francis, I got a question for you. When you write Creator Spotlight, what are the target emotions that you're trying to trigger? And more broadly, because that might be a little bit of a tough question, how do you frame the rest of these elements when you're writing?
No, I think so. A couple thoughts here. One, like this goes to really, it starts when I'm picking people to interview, right? Because what I want people to take away from it is, I guess, glad. If you're gonna pick any of those, it'd be glad. But it's curiosity. I'm trying to like promote curiosity, to promote like learning from these different perspectives. The way I pick people to interview is I want there to be something about this person where the way they approach the craft of producing content, the way they approach distribution, or the way they approach monetization, where that's original or really clever, or I haven't covered somebody who's doing something like that similar for a long time. So I'm trying to deliver that value to the audience. And granted, I don't really know how I'm going to write the newsletter until I sit down and write it. So I think that's the other thing is you maybe start with the end in mind of I want this to be something that's really useful and interesting and fun to read for the audience, but I don't necessarily know how I'm going to get there. The way I approach writing is I sit down, I've got the details, some of the quotes from when I interviewed them, research from when I prepped, and it's like, what are the pieces that if I put it together in this way will be most useful? And then it's the writing, and writing 3,000 words, but I only want it to be 2,000 words. So then I have to cut that all out. And then it's the whittling, the editing stage, like making sure, oh, that doesn't actually really serve that end purpose I'm trying to achieve. So I cut that out. But I think that's an important distinction is you want to have that end goal in mind of, oh, I want this to be useful, or, oh, I want this to like get this person to go to this event I'm promoting, whatever that is. But you find your way there through the wilderness sometimes. You don't have to know the way there. You just have to know the direction you're going.
When you write, do you generally use the same calls to action, or do you customize those? Obviously, you customize them if you're saying, hey, go visit this person's profile or something like that. But do you generally use the same kind of calls to action when you're publishing week after week? Do you modify those when you're on the podcast versus the newsletter? How do you think about those things?
I think the main call to action I'm thinking of is the newsletter subject line and the YouTube podcast title, because that's the main thing, right? We're less clicking out within the newsletter than I just want people to read this when it lands in their inbox, or for it to get caught up in the YouTube algorithm and people to click on it. I'm definitely like testing different things, but you start to notice a pattern, right? And once you start to notice that pattern, then that's what you start building around. I know that the YouTube podcast is generally more successful when it says something about how this person made this much money or grew their audience this much. So then I start falling into a rhythm of that CTA. And then once you have that kind of creative limit, though, you can push at it in other ways where it's, okay, I know that this is going to be something about how much money this person made in this 1 year because that's what's going to promote clicks. But around that, I've got 3, 4, 5, 6 other words I can put in that title. How do I also get in like something else about this one to make it seem unique? Because when it's the same call to action every time, sometimes that's fine. I think I heard some principle once, like in digital marketing, it takes people 7 times of seeing something before they click on it, something like that. So you do want to repeat and you don't want to worry about it, but you also want to test new things within it.
Yeah, it makes sense. The last thing I want to say here is that there's also not similar, but there's another digital marketing principle that's at play here where, and maybe this is just more like UX for the web, but you always want to be able to provide users with a next step to take. You never want to leave them hanging. You never want to create that dead end experience. And so what I mean by that is if you go to most websites, including beehiiv sites, the bottom of somebody reads the post, at the bottom there's always continue, you may be interested in, and then other articles, or continue reading, and then like other articles that they can read. And the idea there is when you have the attention, when you create a dead end experience, you lose that attention. It's like a perfect, you can keep the train rolling, you can continue to keep making those connections with the reader. But when you lead to a dead end, it then breaks them out of that kind of cycle where then they have to evaluate, okay, what am I going to do next? I can't do anything here. Do I just go back? I already was on the previous page. I don't really have a purpose to go back. I'm going to bounce, and then they move on with their day. And so when we're talking about trying to capture attention and basically build these like really raving great fans, it's important that we have that call to action, right? Regardless of how basic it is, so that we have that experience for the people who want to continue engaging to be able to do, and they don't just get cut off at the end of a dead-end cul-de-sac. Cool. Next, we've laid some of the groundwork. Next is developing a consistent voice and tone. And this is, I think, one of the more challenging parts for a lot of writers because they have ideas of what a ideal voice and tone might feel like, but maybe they don't know how to basically either achieve it, or they don't necessarily know what their voice and tone should be. And yeah, I think that this is one of the areas in which some folks get blocked a little bit. And so we're going to help unblock that with Francis's help. So the first thing is really, like we said, we're going back to the beginning, understanding your newsletter's unique personality. If you follow beehiiv on social media, we have a very unique voice through our social channel that is the brainchild of our social media manager. It's a very kind of friendly, but maybe a little bit irreverent persona of the brand. And our users love that brashness and love the kind of realness of the brand. They're very real people. They don't necessarily appreciate like the very sanitized like corporate speak that is so common in like big, huge SaaS companies. And so in that case, we have this very unique brand voice. And then alternatively, I talked to point two. In the newsletter world, our CEO, Tyler Dank, has a newsletter called Big Desk Energy. And when you read it, his voice and tone is literally exactly the way that he talks. If you're reading this newsletter, I can hear his voice. I've heard it long enough and enough that when I read, I can really just hear his words in my head because he writes incredibly similar to how he would speak, a very kind of unassuming, unpretentious, but very clear way of expressing ideas. And so in each of these cases, these tones are really congruent with the content that's being conveyed. So in Big Desk Energy, it's his personal newsletter around the lessons he's learned building a startup. So it's very genuine. There's a great deal of feeling very connected to him as a writer. With the beehiiv brand, again, we want to be creative. We want to show and walk the walk of creativity that we espouse to our users. And so these are just different ways in which I've seen the unique personality come through. But it's a deliberate decision. It doesn't just happen. It often takes some practice and some refining to understand, okay, this works. This isn't, write a couple editions, review, and this is really working. This isn't. We'll get into some more with Francis's advice there in a second. But the second component, really making sure that you're using language that's like resonating and feeling accessible to your audience. This is kind of how you can drill down once you understand who that audience is and how you want to talk to them. Understanding what language do they use. So if you, going back to the suburban housewife example, if you start talking at them with a very kind of Gen Z, tech-heavy vernacular, it's not going to be compelling because that's just not how that audience thinks and speaks. It's not going to sound genuine. It's not going to connect. And so it's really important to understand that if you are not writing to an audience that is like native to your own tone and voice, that may be something you want to consider. Next, maintaining that consistency across your different touch points of your brand can be a valuable way to really cement this. So an example would be, we look at the Duolingo bird and Duolingo's social media presence. It's like very similar that there's like a through line between their very brash and pushing the envelope social media content and the way, for example, that like the app shows up on your phone. If you have a streak that expires, the bird and the little icon gets all disheveled and very sad and disappointed. And it basically continues that brand experience through different touch points. And with newsletters, this is usually going to be done using social media and using your newsletter itself. And it can even extend to media like, I think there was somebody in the chat who was doing a podcast. If you're a YouTuber as well, you don't really want these disparate experiences or tones across different platforms. They can be slightly different and you can certainly tailor them for each media, but you don't want to be like super professor studious, very formal in one, and then Gen Z slang and completely different on a separate channel. One way you can enforce this, especially if you're working on a team or if you do plan on building kind of a media brand from this, is creating a style guide to reference and use as a lens that you can share and duplicate with your team or to gut check yourself. Francis, I know you have a very unique, very polished style about it. We'd love to hear how you've taken these principles and add any of your own to how you approach.
Yeah, one important one for me that really solidified only within the last few months. So I've been writing Creator Spotlight now for a year, right? And at first, especially because I'm highlighting other people, I didn't really want to put much of myself in it. So instead of saying I within the body of the newsletter, I would say we, and I would try not to insert my opinion so much and be more of an observer. But then there were a few times where I started writing original essays that weren't about a guest and more like drawing on many past interviews and other things I read, etc. And those got really great responses. And I think there's multiple reasons for that. But one, I think, was because I was putting myself so much into it. So since then, I have started putting the I more into even these profile pieces. And I think people have been responding well to that. And I think that's a blanket rule for newsletters, really all creator type media generally. That's the way things are moving, right? People want that individual perspective. They want the other person there. They want, not that it has to be such a parasocial relationship, but they want that feeling that there is somebody on the other end, I think. So I definitely encourage in almost any kind of newsletter. I even think of things, Semaphore, which is like a new media brand newsletter that comes from people who come from traditional media, but it is this newsletter-based brand, and they use the I. It's very personal in there. So I think just no matter what topic you're covering, your newsletter, some of the personality, doesn't have to be like you in your everyday life, but it should be you, a version of you, and you shouldn't be afraid to use that I in there and break with some of the formality. Otherwise, yeah, try to speak the language of your audience, but I think don't veer always too far. And sometimes it's a good idea too, but I think it's always a good idea to look in other places too. Like 80%, 85% of the way you're writing should be within sort of the language of your audience, as it were, their modes of speaking and slangs, whatever, but you should insert things from elsewhere. I don't know. I try to read things as much as I can that aren't related to the creator economy or what I write about, because that's how you keep the soup interesting. Throw in some different ingredients. So yeah, I think those are my main points. Put yourself into it, use the eye, and then read a lot of like other products in your space, but don't just take from there, or else you'll just look like every other product in your space.
That's great. And aside from reading other things that maybe add the ingredients to the soup, so to speak, are there any other resources that you use when you're writing to check yourself or to ensure that's like something that some folks use like Hemingway or something like that? Do you use any tools that can help with this process?
Yeah, so the only two tools I use Claude in the editing phase. So once I've written up as I was saying earlier, like the 3,000 words, and I want it, the whole newsletter, it's not that whatever, the one section's 3,000, but the whole newsletter I try to keep at 2,000 words or below, including every line of copy in there. I take the steal this, or the in the spotlight section, which is the profile section. Let's say that's 1,600 words, and I put it into Claude, and I'm like, I need to cut 400, 500 words off of this. Are there any areas you think don't serve the audience? I have this like rating system. I'm like, rate it 1 to 10 on, what is it? Clarity, utility, style. There's one other, I forget. But so I have it rated on those scales, and then also point out where I could cut. And then I don't use AI generated copy in the newsletter. That's my style. I like the writing. To me, part of the fun here is the craft of writing. And yeah, so that really helps me because I don't have a second editor currently. Will soon. Don't have a second editor to do that for me. So this is a way of expediting time, right? And I could come back the next day with fresher eyes and do that myself, but this is a good way of expediting that kind of editorial rigor. And then the other one is, after I do that, when I finally proofread, I do put it into grammar. And again, I don't just accept things, and I look at every single detail and I decide whether or not that suggestion is worth applying, and then I copy that. If so, I copy it back to the draft in beehiiv.
Amazing. And is that process with Claude, is that like a custom? Do they do custom GPTs, or is that just like a prompt that you've developed?
Just a prompt. I'm not the most sophisticated AI user, to be honest with you. I just go in, I'm like, this is the audience I'm serving. These are what I think their priorities are. Again, going back, like I feed it that kind of audience profile information, and I say, this is what I'm trying to write. This is what I'm trying to achieve with this. All the slides we've been covering. I just give it like that context of who I'm writing for and why, and the format it is like, and then I put it in. I say, help me cut this down.
Got it. No, that totally makes sense. Cool. That's super helpful, I'm sure. As we drill down from like the kind of highest level to getting more and more into the weeds and into the specifics, as you've developed your process, you have your voice, you have your audience, you know the general kind of outline of what you want to say. When you go down to start writing, whether you do this at the beginning of your process or whether you write your content and you come with at the end, the first thing that a reader is going to read is generally going to be called your hook. And the hook is like that intro that grabs the attention and just doesn't let go, or at least ideally doesn't let go. The goal is to say, get somebody to read one line and then get them to want to just need to read the next line to figure out like where this is going. Francis, real quick, before I go to the rest of the slide, do you have a better description of that? Is that you probably you think about this all the time?
No, I think, well, one thing about a hook, I think Tyler actually said this, I took this from him, is that it's not, and I think he got it from somebody else, but it's not clickbait if it delivers on what it's promising. So I'm always trying to be provocative, but never disingenuous. So I think, yeah, the hook should be, again, you have to earn people's attention. Nobody owes you their attention. So you have to really earn it and fight for it. But then if you're putting something provocative in there, you have to deliver on it. And this is the scale of the newsletter title, a YouTube title, the first sentence of a paragraph, whatever. If you want people to continue engaging, you have to keep giving them something like, wait, I want to lean in and learn more, but you also have to deliver on it.
Absolutely. So with that, you want to be creating these. The hook would be, what's an example off the top of your head? Could you come up with one? You probably have seen way more than I have recently. I work more in the realm of like ad hooks, which are a little bit of a different flavor, but help me out real quick.
One of my favorites actually from the newsletter was just garbage pays, which I think is great because it's 2 words. It leans in on what I was saying, where people love it when it's talking about money, and it's like garbage pays. So it's, wait, I can create something that's garbage and it'll pay me. But then it was a newsletter. It was about a guy who has Ryan Broderick. His newsletter is called Garbage Day. And so immediately you open it and you realize what the pun is, but 2 words, provocative, says something about money. I thought it was such a good lean hook.
That sounds like it fits exactly with that first bullet point of clear, concise, and attention grabbing. But that's a great example. With that hook, you're juxtaposing 2 things that generally wouldn't go together, that are really contradictory, that for somebody who's already opted into the newsletter, who knows what you're offering from a content perspective, which is tips and tricks and features of newsletters who have gone, or creators who have built large 10 to 100,000 user audiences. Within that context, seeing something that's like garbage pays, again, like you're saying, is super interesting. And being so short, really being able to evoke so much emotion with just such a short 2-word phrase can be really powerful as a subject line. And then you basically have to keep it rolling as they open up the email and can start reading. But that's a great example. So your hook should be something along the lines of just like this curiosity driving, emotion evoking type of just very quick, usually 1 sentence. It can be also a subject line depending on your medium. But if it's a subject line, it needs to really continue that oomph into the content. Or if it's the first line of your content, the goal is to keep it rolling, keep that reader reading and moving just from next. But in that way, power words to evoke emotion and curiosity are critical. So in that case, garbage pays, like garbage is a pretty bold word. And so is putting that together with getting paid. We know that users typically respond to different things around like how they can get paid. So just like a really clean combination there. But it's evoking these emotions of like curiosity, of incongruency, which is going to break the mold and grab attention. One of the things that you can do with beehiiv and some other platforms, but what's really clean in beehiiv, is to actually A/B test this process when you send a newsletter. You can set up multiple subject lines, so you can actually see which one works better. And the way we set it up is that you set a percentage of your audience to send to, maybe it's 10%, 20%. You set a testing window, so say 60 minutes to 90 minutes. And so when you hit send, we will send each, if you did 20% of your audience, each kind of half of that audience, so 10% and 10%, would each receive one of the 2 different headlines. You can do up to 4, so it'd be as few as 5% in this case, but they each receive a different version of the headline. We run statistical analysis on the open rate, and whichever one performs better, the rest of your audience, the other 80%, will receive the winning one, which in some cases can be really quite dramatic in terms of the difference in open rate. If you've seen some of our webinars with Tyler, he does this all the time, every single send, and it makes a huge difference in terms of his engagement. But it can also tell you, that process can really tell you what your audience responds to. Francis ran these tests over and over again. He could find that like super short, incongruous subject lines, maybe that's what he can train his users to expect if it works really well and has the ability to be replicated, where users are going to expect to see something that's like kind of shocking but curiosity driving. And when they see just like those 2 or 3 words in comparison to like the rest of their inbox, which is like these huge long subject lines, they're going to know that they're in for a treat, which can help build that voice, build that brand. Similarly, optimizing your preview text to complement that subject line is a really valuable way to provide more context to the hook. I don't know how Francis deals with this specifically, but a lot of times if you have that kind of like almost, I would not say clickbaity, but if you have that hook that kind of asks a question or says something a little bit shocking, you can continue to bait people a little bit more by, it's like the very classic, it's like the top 10 things for X, you won't believe number 8. It's like, you won't believe number 8 would be that preview text, where it helps support the top and just amps up that curiosity up to 11. How do you think about subject or preview text when you're publishing Creator Spotlight? Does it tend to complement that? What do you do?
I actually think mine could be better. This is something I need to develop. So I'll say how I do it, and then I'll give another example that I think is done really well. So the way I do it is because I'm usually giving less context in the subject line itself. I'll write like just .ft. It's like featuring, and then the person's name, and then what they do. So I'm like, I deliver a bit on the kind of tease of the subject line in the preview line, but not so much. But it's okay, like here's what this is about. But one of my favorite examples actually is, again, Ryan Broderick with Garbage Day. He does this better than pretty much I can't think of any other newsletter that does great preview lines but his. So he'll have his title, and then the preview line will be like, scroll to the end for, I think yesterday it was like, scroll to the end for Stew Prisoner. And what this is, at the very bottom of every newsletter, he puts a link to some inane video that was on social media or meme, whatever it was, like some pretty good, funny social media post that was trending within the past 24 hours or so. And he says he uses it as like a metric for like how many people are actually getting to the end too, because that's then a link that he can see how many people clicked on it. So it's just really clever. And he called it his Simpsons couch gag, right? Where it's what's the 30-second thing that takes such a little investment from any member of the audience, but like they know is going to be funny every time. Yeah. So I think that's genius. And having something like that where it's like it's almost, I don't know, with Morning Brew, I used to scroll down to the end to do like the quiz, right? And it's I maybe didn't read the newsletter at all, or maybe I read part of it, but I would go down to the end for that little thing that would take 20 seconds of my time and give me a little dopamine hit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great process. I love that. That makes total sense. Cool. Yeah, the chat is blowing up, absolutely going wild for that tip as well. Aaron is like all on it. I love it. Cool. So from the hook, we now have talked about the intro. Again, whether you do this at the beginning or not, what else do we cover here? I think maybe the editing for clarity part gets into the order in which you do these things. You don't have to come up with a hook at the beginning. If you know what you want to talk about, but you're not necessarily sure what you're going to write to hook the user, write your content, figure out what the entire article is going to be first, get the content down, and that maybe can provide some illumination. So moving on to the structure, it's really important, especially with newsletters, that you really think about the user experience and kind of the readability of a post. And so this can be different than certainly like writing a blog post or something that may be like very dense and very heavy in terms of content, and which may sound like a contradiction because beehiiv does provide the power to do blogs. And certainly if you're writing long form content for the web, you want to think about the content very differently. But you have to consider how most people are going to consume the content, and that's through their phones on their mobile device, where just a big block of narrow text is like very hard to read. And so some of this stuff may sound really basic, but you'd be surprised at how many people overlook these things. And one of the key things, Francis, I'm sure, please share this story. I know you do this every time. It's like the thing you saw, I think you read it on social media or whatever, where it's like the varying lengths of each sentence really provides nice.
Oh no, this is my original, baby. I think of it like climbing a wall, like rock climbing something, or a ladder, right? Where it's like you want there to be something to grasp onto, right? There has to be texture. There has to be something for the eye to get caught on. You don't want just like one wall of text with no line breaks and no sentence breaks, whatever. Nobody's going to read that. There's nothing to grasp onto. You don't know where the walls are when you're trying to read through it, right? But when you have thoughtfully, not like, on the other hand, I'm personally not a fan of when it's every sentence, line break sentence. That to me is equally texturally uniform. You want textural diversity in the visual layout. It gives the reader something to chew on and something to grasp onto, but in different ways each time. So you have maybe one paragraph is just one sentence. Then you have a 6-sentence paragraph, a 3-sentence, whatever. But you want a diversity of texture that helps the eye move through it without getting bored and routine.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think maybe we probably don't even need the rest of the slide now. That is such a great encapsulation of kind of what this is trying to say. And so in that way, maybe being a little bit redundant, one of the things, obviously varying lengths of paragraphs, obviously that's what you just shared about. One of the things I would say that some people maybe use a little bit less, whether it's just less familiarity with the platform or less, just like maybe it's an afterthought, but like varying that texture using things like headings and subheadings and really using the whole menagerie of the different subheading levels. So we have in the platform H1 through H6, which are just different presets of headings, but really effective ways in which to like break up that text. So your H1 classically is like the title, and then you could go to H2, which is like the different sections of your newsletter, and then in H3 could be subsections, and H4 subsections of that. Really helps to orient users because they can see, okay, cool, this header is the same size as the previous one. I'm still in this block of subsection, and then there's a break, and then it goes back to the big one. You can say, okay, cool, I'm done with that. A little breathing room, little aperitif after the meal, allow you to digest a little bit. Or is that a digestif? Aperitif is before. A little digestif.
That's a digestif.
After the meal, in between courses. And yeah, super useful, of course, bullet points, white space, the absence of content being content in itself, but of course, bullet points, just like very clear points. But aside from that, highlighting text, you can make highlights in the beehiiv editor, different texture to the weights. So bold, italic, strike through, all of these things can add to it. One of the things I love to do and love to see is like when you are like writing in text, it's like if you have a thought where it's like, how to explain this, where it's like you're trying to subvert somebody's expectation of what you're going to say. Do you type the regular thing and then you like use the strike through and then replace the strike through with whatever the punchline is. It just makes it such a conversational, adds some like character to what you're writing. I don't know if that's the best example. It's just what came to mind. Similarly, there's like the physical structure, like visually. There's also the narrative structure, which we talk about here in following the logical flow. This might be where something like elements of style comes into play. There's some of these classic books that are 150,000 years old that are just like the seminal writings. I think I have one. I have a
Strunk and White.
I have Strunk and White literally right here. I haven't started reading it yet.
I just bought another one, Ben Dreyer, I think is his name. I just got that one this last week, but I haven't started it yet. It's been too long since I've gotten into the style books. Also, I want to say, Tina, in the chat, you're saying, what about the use of graphics? Applies to the same thing, this like textural idea, right? You want to always use graphics, right? You want to make sure they're good, but a good graphic is like such a good texture palette cleanser for a lot of text, right? Especially if it's not very text heavy. Even if it could be informative and data rich or whatever, or it could just be like a nice little illustration or a screenshot, whatever. When I do screenshots, also I would say in beehiiv, I always make the corners rounded and put the border on them to make it like feel more integrated into the newsletter. But yeah, graphics are like always good, always such a great way of just like a cold glass of water on the palette if it's like a really text heavy piece.
Absolutely. Especially you see this a lot with like news publications, like actually like newsletters, where it's like you have the headline and then you have the image that starts to paint the picture. It grounds you in this. You have a headline that could be about anything, and then this image paints this picture worth 1,000 words, famously, that then allows you to be in the right mindset. Can be very effective, for example, if the headline is something about some tragedy and then there's a picture of like the devastation caused. It's like it frames you emotionally, almost like an aperitif for what is to come, which is like getting you in that frame of mind. So it would really not make sense if you saw people, there's a terrible headline and then people celebrating and then like reading about the tragedy, you'd be like, what the heck? This makes no sense. It would be very jarring.
And then you get like the Axios smart brevity, like bullet point things, which if we're continuing the food metaphor here, that's like a salad where it's really light, but there is some nutrition there and it really sets your palate up.
There you go. We're going to refine, we'll have these fine dining.
We're workshopping it live.
We'll have them super tight for the next webinar together. The last thing we mentioned, important to have a call to action, and that's like the key part of structuring your content, whatever you're writing about. Newsletters, perfect like medium for including that call to action, whether you have an actual button, whether it's like hyperlink text, whether it's just something like take a second and think about this. It doesn't have to be taking them somewhere if you don't necessarily want to be. It could be go do something nice in your community. It's a call to action that is like leading them somewhere, but not necessarily keeping them on the site. We talked about grabbing attention and holding on to it. There might be cases where can be more effective to relinquish that attention, depending on like how you want to be perceived. Cool. Next, we've got tell story. Oh, shoot. There we go. That'll be fun. We should grab that little soundbite for a short. I hope that didn't sound as funny to you guys as it did to me. I just started clicking and it just started rushing me through the slides. So telling stories, engage your reading. As it's a tale of as old as time. Story, it's the thesis of this whole thing is that captivating readers requires an element of storytelling, whether it's a news story, whether it's something like Morning Brew where you're conveying stuff in a comical way. It's all storytelling. And it's really, I can't really think of any newsletters that I've come across that exist that don't have an element of like storytelling, even if it's in the kind of most high level sense. Even something that's like a very high level, maybe even aggregator of news, it's not just like vomiting just like links at you or headlines. It's like there usually is, hey, welcome, here's the new top stories of the day at the very least, and then it has you introduce them. So it has like an arc to it in some way. But stories are killer for driving that engagement. The more you can refine your storytelling technique and refine your storytelling talents, the more successful you'll be. I can promise you that. And that doesn't go for newsletters by itself. It goes for if you're at a dinner party, if you're with friends, if you're at work. In any kind of scenario, building the storytelling gene is something that, or building the storytelling muscle, you can't build genes, is one of the most valuable things you can do to get your ideas across. This goes back to when we were sitting around the campfires.
Isn't it like Joan Didion? I don't know if it's Joan Didion. Whoever said that we tell ourselves stories in order to live, right? This slide too is the entire conceit of Creator Spotlight. I wanted to communicate ideas and like methods of surviving in the creator economy, of producing quality content, of building an audience, of building a business. But there's plenty of people who do that in a very stripped back tactical way. And I knew that they would do it better than me, that I wouldn't have necessarily the sharp tactical approach. but that I like telling stories. And so that's why Creator Spotlight is a series where I interview people and then write out their story, because I think that's the best way to deliver this kind of information, right? It's that educate, entertain, inform are like the three things a piece of content should do, usually one or all of those things. And I've had readers tell me specifically that Creator Spotlight does all those things. So I think, yeah, you got to tell a story.
Yeah, it's if you think about all of the major stories that have been broken over the past, not all, I shouldn't say all, because that is going to get me into trouble. But you think of the major stories that have broken over the past maybe 10 years or so, the ones that I remember memorably, they all were broken by journalists who really tell this like narrative arc. And I'm thinking of the big headline banner on New York Times or whatever, whether it's the Panama Papers, whether it's the Theranos scandal, whatever it is. All of these things, you click into them and it puts you immediately like in through the eyes of an executive in the room when something went wrong. It's so-and-so knew something was wrong when Elizabeth Holmes walked into the room and was like trying to hide stuff. It's whatever it was. It is way more compelling. It's even just as terrible as that was as a storytelling intro, way more compelling, even just so poorly done than just saying, yeah, this Theranos was doing some sketchy stuff. When you are able to bring real people and you're able to tell a story, it is much easier to evoke the emotions, as we talked about in the beginning. And just as humans, we want to empathize and connect with other people. And that aspect of storytelling can really allow that. So anecdotes, personal experiences, perfect example. They don't have to be your personal experiences. They can be the personal experiences of people that you're writing about. I know, Francis, you do this all the time. That's like the entire intro to your posts most of the time, or many of the times. Case studies and success stories. So these are either full-blown case studies. These can just be also just proof metrics of this person went from living in their car to living in a penthouse. That's just, it helps you show that the through line from beginning to end, from low to high. Can be useful to balance informative content with entertaining elements. Of course, you don't want to just go on, unless your newsletter is all about just like fiction, you don't want to go on a journey to just all over the place, because you're going to lose people most likely, unless that's like what your newsletter is about. Usually, and it again comes down to the audience, you want to keep a nice balance where you're getting to the meat of it. And then lastly, that narrative arc, if you have ever studied something like the hero's journey or some of the funky alternative story narratives that like Kurt Vonnegut used, I don't recommend those per se, but the hero's arc is tried and true. Yeah, the other ones you may not get you as far, but maybe it was. Maybe that's what you need to really find your alpha. Anyway, get good at storytelling. Lastly, with the last couple minutes, we'll be really quick here, but it's super important. At the end of it, you have your content, you've got it all on the paper. Francis mentioned before, a lot of times he'll write 3,000 words and cut it down to what, 2,000?
Yep.
Write, get it all out there, and then cut. A lot of writing advice will tell you just write and do not edit until you're done writing. Don't change anything. Just write. Don't go back and change anything. Just get it all out. Get everything out of your head onto paper, and then come back and then refine and revise.
It took me like 20 years to make myself be able to do that. It's hard, but that's the only way to do it.
Absolutely. So set that time up. Make sure that if you're working with deadlines for your newsletter, that you're not writing yourself into a corner. And then in terms of tactical stuff, again, this is something that Francis shared is like really great use of AI, because it can analyze and refine really quickly and pick up on a lot of those, because these tools are just large language models. It's literally, they just use language from trillions of data points of language. So it's taking some writing is literally the bread and butter of what they do, and can do it really well typically. Making those connections between the different phrases and structure that you're using, it can really help refine. But removing unnecessary words and phrases. One thing that's super helpful to do is, if I used to get this feedback, usually for stuff that was like written old fashioned, like analog, is read it backwards, start from the end. Is really helpful for if you're doing something. I guess in today's world we have spell check, but like spell check's not perfect. You can have two words that are the same, spelled differently, but mean the same thing. If you read backwards, it can really help you identify where you may have made a mistake in terms of adding additional content or duplicating words, spelling words wrong. When you look at sentences, your brain actually processes the sentence as a whole. It doesn't actually process the individual words as much as it seems like we do as we read. There's a ton of context actually that comes from the entire sentence structure. They've done studies on this. And it's why it can be really hard to spot issues. It's famously, there's these videos where something is a short sentence, but it has the word the twice. And it takes people 20 minutes to find the mistake, because you're not reading each letter. Even when you read it word by word, a lot of times people miss it because you're not reading the sentence word by word. You're reading it within this context of the entire sentence. So reading it backwards takes away that context of the sentence and allows you to spot those changes. Similarly, reading that content aloud can help you catch that awkward phrasing. And of course, always have somebody else review can be super, super helpful. The point here, these are all pretty basic editing and revision tips. They're all the tried and true ones. But the ruthlessly and clarity are pulling a lot of weight in this headline. Don't be afraid to really cut and get to the bone. That's really where you're going to drive the most impact. When you can get really clear with your writing, that's what's going to move people to take whatever action you're trying to get them to do. With that said, we're coming up on the end. Let's see. Do we have some questions in the chat? So we have 2 questions so far for the Q&A with the last couple minutes. The first one is, how might I email or re-engage subscribers that have already gone through the welcome automation? I'd love to send out an email or emails to resurface older content from the archive. Francis, is this something you've done? I have some ideas here around like
you should take this one. This is something I need to do, but and I know a lot of the best newsletters do it, but I don't currently have that set up. It's I'll admit it, live on tape, big blind spot. But I'll let you speak to that.
Yeah, sure. The best way or the easiest way is likely going to be to set up an automation. I don't know if you're like, there's 2 different automations in beehiiv. There's like the basic one that every account comes with, where it's like somebody submits their email, they get the welcome email. It's one step, every account. With our paid plans, you get access to our automations suite, which allows you to create really flexible, kind of infinitely flexible journeys based on pretty much any trigger that you can imagine. And so with that one, what we recommend if you are on a paid plan is setting up the automations that you have multiple steps. And so you might send your welcome email on day 1, and then a day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, you send a second follow-up, regardless of what newsletter you may have sent them. It's just a secondary follow-up saying, hey, thanks so much for signing up. I hope that it's not finds you. That's the worst that's played out. But here's some content that basically I thought you might find useful, some of our greatest hits or something like that, gives them like a place to start. A lot of times people will add that in the very first email. So it's add us to your address book and do all this stuff. And by the way, here's the stuff. I don't prefer that one as much, just because like my philosophy around email marketing is that every email should do one thing and one thing only, whether it's like to get them to take an action or inform. It's like when you start trying to do 2 things, have somebody add you to an address book and then also give them content, it's like you're going to do neither one really well. So I'd say, yeah, send them the welcome email, thank them for joining, have them whitelist, maybe even respond with a question. You have a question, ask them to respond, give some engagement and those engagement signals in the inbox. And maybe the next day they say, hey, thanks again for subscribing. I figured these might be helpful. Here's some of the greatest hits that most people find valuable. Next question, what crucial aspect do creators often overlook while growing subscribers from 0 to 1,000? I can take this one first, and I'd love to hear your perspective, Francis. What I'd say here is that when you're going from 0 to 1,000, the only concern that you should have is reaching that content market fit. And so content market fit is very similar to like product market fit in startups. There's a lot of writing about it, but it's essentially matching your tone, your audience, your writing, basically matching your product and finding your audience. And once you do that, you'll notice that you start to grow organically, whether it's your people who are reading it are sharing it on social, they're referring it to friends, but you're being picked up and just found and getting a lot of traction with your social posts. When that starts to happen, you know that you've reached that product market fit, and then it's just a matter of time before you hit that 1,000. And so if you are not growing organically, that is really the only concern that you should have, and not design necessarily. Make it so your design isn't terrible, but really matching that content. People will forgive you for like very basic design as long as the content is there. And as long as it's not like a design newsletter, then it's like you obviously want the design to look good. But so yeah, basically number one priority, find your niche, find your audience, find that growth and that initial traction. And when you start doing that, then you'll grow. Because if you're growing organically, it's just a matter of time, whether it's a week or a month or whatever. If you're growing organically, you will hit that 1,000 subscribers. And if you can hit 1,000, you can hit 100,000. Francis, any thoughts there?
No, I fully agree with you. I think you have to, the trick is to make something that 1,000 people think is good enough to sign up for. It's really as simple as that. I would also say there's a good short version of this in the most recent issue of Creator Spotlight. If you go to creatorspotlight.com, go to the most recent post. He spent $20 million growing newsletters. Scroll down to the Steal This Tactic section. Matt McGarry, who, aka the newsletter guy, I interviewed him last week, and he broke down like the most basic version of getting to 1,000. So I would recommend reading that. But yeah, the number one thing is you got to make good content. You have to make something people want. It's as hard and as simple as that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It sounds a little bit cliche, but I promise you it's not. It's literally the beginning and the end of it. If you can reach 1,000 people, and I'm not saying it's like if you have a giant family and a big friend group that those 1,000 people are your friends and family. These should be 1,000 strangers. Compel 1,000 strangers to want to hear your writing, and you'll be able to reach as many as you want. The last question we'll cover before we jump, because we're going over just a little bit, is how do you know if a content niche is fully saturated? I would say that there's not really such a thing. There's always something that can be disruptive. And so there's certainly niches that are easier to crack than others. But if one thing I've seen with these thousands of AI newsletters and before the crypto newsletters starting up, there is always an angle that can be filled. And it just depends on like matching that content with your audience and finding that specific audience of people. The thing that I would say is like 99% of the time, people actually don't niche down far enough, and that's why they don't succeed. I use the example of nutrition. If I wanted to do like a nutritional like diet newsletter, if I just said, I'm going to write about nutritional food, like that would be way too broad, because some people think vegetarianism is like the perfect way to eat. Other people, like the exact opposite, think like carnivore diet is like the only way to be healthy.
There's no opinion there. You need an opinionated point of view.
And so what I think about is I think about my girlfriend it's so restrictive that whenever she meets somebody else who follows the same way of eating, it's just like long lost friends, even if they've never met each other, because they both can immediately understand kind of the trials and tribulations that they go through trying to get served at restaurants, trying to make sure that they can actually eat. And in that case, if I was going to write, I would say, okay, I want to target that audience, very, very niche. Maybe I'm even going to focus on like women who are like urban from to 30. So it's like very specific, like these are early young professional women who are this very restricted. There's so much I can work with there. I know where I'm going to be posting my content. I know what type of content I'm going to be posting. I know what a lot of their challenges and what they're worried about is if I do a little bit of basic research. There's so much that I know about that you could even go more niche, maybe not. Maybe that's not that useful, but it's like there's no way that you're ever going to find, if that's a viable niche, there's no way that niche really gets too saturated, I don't think, because it's like you can always find value as long as you're presenting value. Do I have anything to add there, Francis?
No, I agree. Yeah, just come up with an opinion point of view. Don't say I'm going to make the next morning brew and try to make a business newsletter you can read in 5 minutes every morning that rounds up whatever that's already been done. Just don't do the thing that's already been done. This is what I was saying earlier about read things outside of whatever space you're operating in. Add those new things to the soup. Make a new soup.
That's maybe the quote of the event. I will say also, just to put a pin on that, even Morning Brew, like they were super niche when they launched. It's like we think about where they are today because they've reached this kind of like mass market consciousness, but they didn't start like that. They were very niched down when they started. They were focused on students taking business courses in colleges. So it's like they would literally go to class and just get people in their classes to sign up and would write to these very specific like 18 to 22-year-old business students at, I think, Michigan was to start. And once they found that audience fit, then it was very easy for them to duplicate that model at other schools, because they already knew who that audience was and what compelled them. Like students at Michigan are not that different from students at Ohio State, fight me. Or Maryland, I should say, where we are now. It's like those business students all have a ton in common. So once you crack the code in one place, it's easy to duplicate. And that's really the key. Once you find that product market fit, the key is to use those learnings to then be able to duplicate what you're doing to reach more people. If this was helpful, we highly recommend joining the exclusive Slack community that we host over on Slack. Open to all of our paying customers. It's not an add-on. It's not an upsell. Anybody who pays for beehiiv is welcome to add this community. We have 20 different channels, from cross-promotion requests to design feedback to email 101, growth tactics, celebration channels, whatever you want. We have a little bit for everything. Dozens, if not hundreds of messages every day going out. I think we have 3,400 people in the community, more than 3,400 active paying beehiiv users. So it's like one of the most value dense places to really coalesce and interact with other newsletter publishers, just like yourself, who are on this journey, who are serious about their newsletter growth. So if you're on the fence, this can be a great resource. You can get questions, feedback, answers any time of day, globally. Otherwise, if you want more of this content, we shared the link to our archive of past webinars. And if you go to beehiiv.com/webinars, you'll see the upcoming webinars. I hope you will join for some of those. Thank you so much for showing up today. Really appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure to be able to share this with you. You guys make it worthwhile. The people who are in this room, the 12 of you who are still with us, the 30 or 40 who joined through. And if you're watching this as a recording, we're thinking about you right now on the other side of the screen. There we go. Yes. We care about you too, and we're so appreciative that you've decided to spend your time with us. Thank you for Tony, who's been in the background answering questions and managing the chat. We look forward to serving you. And if you guys have any questions further, reach out to us on socials. We're very active on X, LinkedIn, Blue Sky. Threads now,
Blue Sky.
YouTube, EJ_beehiiv, at beehiiv everywhere. I don't know what Francis's is.
I think it's Zierer on Twitter, X, on LinkedIn, on Blue Sky. You can find me. It's linked in some of the newsletters.
Yeah, exactly. If you have any questions, if you are perhaps a paying beehiiv user who doesn't have access to the Hive, sometimes you miss the email or whatever, just send me an email, ej@beehiiv.com, and we'll get you connected with the community manager who can add you to the. Otherwise, if you do upgrade, you'll get an email, you'll get the invite right after you upgrade your account. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful Tuesday. We look forward to seeing what you all build.